Welcome to the entire story of women samurai. Boring history for sleep. Tonight, in the soft rhythm of this quiet hour, we turn to the forgotten pages of Japan's past, where women once walked the path of the warrior. Their stories do not thunder with drums of conquest, but flow gently, like streams in the early morning mist, subtle, steady, enduring. Within these whispers, we find the Onna-Bugeisha, women of discipline and strength who trained their hands to hold both tenderness and steel. Though history often dims their presence, their shadows remain, reminding us that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it waits in silence. Here, in the calm glow of night, you are invited to rest, to breathe, and to drift slowly into their world. This is Mythoria, where stories soften into dreams. Now, let us begin. The entire story of women samurai. Boring history for sleep. The entire story of women samurai. Whispers at dawn. In the stillness of ancient Japan, you glimpse the quiet beginnings of women who carried blades. Their story is softer than the clash of armor, yet firm as the steel they held. You begin at the edge of a quiet morning, where mist rests gently upon the fields of ancient Japan. The air is cool, the kind that carries silence as if it were a living thing. Somewhere in the distance, a single bird calls, and its note lingers long enough to remind you of how fragile beginnings always feel. In this stillness, you're invited to notice a story, one often left in the shadows. The story of women who carried blades. Most tales of the samurai are filled with the thunder of armored men riding into battle, their banners stretching against the wind. But beneath those louder images lies another current, softer, quieter, almost invisible to history's eye. It is the current of women who lived under the same code of loyalty and duty, women who trained with weapons not for glory, but for survival and protection. Their presence is like a whisper at dawn, subtle, delicate, yet undeniably real. If you close your eyes, you might imagine the faint clink of steel as it rests across a wooden floor. A hand, smaller perhaps, yet steady, reaches for the handle. These women were not born into softness alone. They were born into households that demanded vigilance. When their husbands, fathers, or brothers rode off to war, someone had to stand guard at the threshold. That someone was often them. The dawn itself becomes a metaphor for their place in history. Dawn is never the sun at its height. It is the fragile in-between, the space where light is present, yet still hidden. So too were these women, visible enough to act, but hidden enough to be forgotten. Their lives existed in margins, and yet the margins shaped the page. Imagine a village at first light, roofs covered in dew, smoke curling from small hearths, children still heavy with sleep. In this village, a mother sharpens a blade quietly, her motion practiced, her breath calm. She is not sharpening it for ceremony. She is preparing, should the unthinkable happen, the sudden appearance of enemies at the gate, the cry of alarm rushing down the streets. For her, the weapon is not just metal. It is an extension of duty, of care, of love that protects. This duality is what makes their story so compelling. The same hands that held infants also gripped the naginata, a long pole arm designed for reach and defense. The same voices that sang lullabies could shout commands over walls. To live as a woman in samurai households was to live in constant readiness, even if that readiness was rarely acknowledged by the chroniclers who favored tales of conquest. History records battles with dates and victories, but life at dawn records feelings. Quiet, waiting, hidden strength, the anticipation of what might come. You can almost hear it, the sound of a door sliding open, the sight of a woman stepping onto a veranda, her eyes scanning the horizon, her body trained to notice movement in the distance. The softness of the moment never erases the firmness of her role. As you listen, You might realize that history is not always thunder. Sometimes it is the steady drip of water, the faint breath before words, the moment of pause before action. These women were the pause before battle, the silent guardians of their homes. They were not there to seek fame, yet their vigilance shaped survival for countless families. And so, the whispers at dawn continue. They remind you that stories are not only in the bold strokes, but in the hushed tones between. You feel a gentle question rising inside. How many lives have passed through history unseen, like mist that lingers only for a moment before dissolving in the morning sun? Daughters of the samurai line. You walk through villages where daughters trained alongside sons, learning balance, archery, and the art of defense. These women were not ornaments, but guardians of honor. You find yourself walking into another morning, but this time the air is filled with a different rhythm. Imagine the training grounds of a samurai household. The ground is marked by the steps of children, some sons, some daughters, all moving under the watchful gaze of their elders. It may surprise you to picture young girls here, but they belonged as naturally as the wind belonged to the trees. The daughters of samurai families did not grow up as passive figures waiting in the shadows. Their lives, though quieter than the battlefield songs of their brothers, were shaped by discipline and duty. Each day they were taught to move with balance, to carry themselves with dignity, to understand that their bodies were not just vessels of fragility, but instruments of defense and honor. You can imagine a girl, perhaps no older than 10, holding a wooden bow. Her small fingers tremble slightly as she pulls the string back, but her gaze is steady. Her teacher, maybe her father, maybe her mother, whispers softly, "Breathe with the arrow. Become the arrow." The release is gentle, the sound small, yet in that moment she learns the power of calm precision. For the daughters of the samurai, training was not a game. It was a preparation for futures unknown. They studied archery, they learned to wield the naginata. They practiced the subtle movements of defense. Their lessons were not taught in halls of glory, but in courtyards filled with dust and patience. Each repetition was a reminder. One day, you may need this not for pride, but for survival. Life in these households was woven tightly with the thread of Bushido, the way of the warrior. For men, it meant honor in combat. For women, it meant protection, resilience, and quiet loyalty. The girls absorbed these values not as rigid commandments, but as rhythms of life. To care for the home was a duty. To defend it if needed was the same. As you picture them, you notice the blending of roles. A daughter might learn how to arrange flowers with delicate grace, and in the same afternoon, practice the swing of a blade that could sever an enemy's advance. To outsiders, these dual worlds might seem at odds, but to them, they were two sides of the same truth. Strength and softness were not separate. They were intertwined, like the strands of a braided cord. The training also gave them something more subtle: confidence. To hold a weapon and know its weight was to feel a certain steadiness inside. Even if they never raised it in battle, the knowledge lived within them like a quiet flame. It told them, you are not powerless, you are not invisible, you carry the ability to act when the world demands it. In the hush of evening, when practice was done, perhaps a daughter would sit by a lantern, brushing ink across paper. She might write a poem about cherry blossoms, fleeting and fragile. Yet beneath her words, there lingered the discipline of the day, the fragility of blossoms, the firmness of steel. Both were part of her story. And as generations passed, this training carried forward. Women taught daughters, who in turn taught their own. Though history rarely carved their names into stone, the rhythm of their lessons lived on in muscle, in memory, in the way a child learned to steady her breath before drawing the bow. Here, as you rest in this story, you may find yourself wondering what strength might live in your own quiet practice. What unseen skills rest within you, waiting patiently, like arrows lined in a quiver, until the day they are needed. The Onna-Bugeisha. You hear the name, Onna-Bugeisha, female martial, whispered like a prayer. They carried the naginata, a long curved blade, graceful yet deadly, made to extend reach and protect home. The name itself carries a quiet strength. Onna-Bugeisha, literally, female martial. Say it softly, and it feels like a prayer, an invocation of women who lived by the same warrior code as men, yet whose stories remain hidden beneath centuries of dust. When you imagine the samurai, perhaps you see men in armor, their faces stern, their swords gleaming. But beside that image, in the still places history overlooked, were women who trained, who fought, who defended. These were not symbols or myths. They were real, flesh and breath, women who took up arms when duty called. Their weapon of choice was often the naginata, a pole arm with a curved blade at its tip. Long and elegant, it gave reach and balance, allowing a smaller body to keep distance from larger, stronger opponents. For women, the naginata was both practical and symbolic, graceful, sweeping, protective. With it, they could guard their homes, their children, their honor. Picture a courtyard in the late afternoon. The sun drapes itself low, casting amber shadows. A woman stands with her naginata, her posture calm but alert. She pivots, the blade cutting arcs through the air, her movements both fluid and precise. This is not play, this is practice born of responsibility. Around her, others may watch. Some daughters, some neighbors, each absorbing the quiet power of her form. The Onna-Bugeisha were not merely defenders of households. Some rode into battle. Stories tell of Tomoe Gozen, a legendary warrior of the late 12th century. She fought with unmatched courage, riding into combat with men, her bow steady, her sword sharp. Chroniclers described her as a match for 1,000 warriors, though even these praises often fade into the background of male-centered tales. Yet her name survives, carried forward like a lantern in the dark, proof that women's valor was not an exception, but a reality. But for every Tomoe Gozen written into history, countless others remained unnamed. Their courage unfolded not on grand battlefields, but in smaller acts, holding a gate, protecting a village, shielding a family when enemies drew near. To be Onna-Bugeisha was not always to seek glory, but to accept readiness. It was to say, if no one else stands, I will. You can almost feel the rhythm of their training. Each swing of the blade was not just about muscle. It was about memory, about carrying forward the knowledge of mothers and grandmothers before them. Each stance whispered, you belong to this line, this duty, this way of life. And in that whisper lay an inheritance of quiet resilience. Imagine how it must have felt living in two worlds at once. By day, perhaps weaving cloth or tending to household needs, and yet, in the same breath, knowing the weight of a blade, the feel of a weapon against the palm. This duality was not contradiction. It was completeness. To be both gentle and fierce was not impossible. It was necessary. As you linger in their story, notice how the presence of the Onna-Bugeisha expands the meaning of samurai. They remind us that the warrior's path was not bound by gender alone. It was bound by loyalty, by readiness, by the willingness to protect what one loved. And so, the image of the Onna-Bugeisha becomes clear. A woman poised at the edge of history, her naginata glinting in the fading light, her heart steady, her spirit unshaken. She is both symbol and reality, both legend and truth. Now, as the scene fades, a quiet question arises in you. How many guardians of history remain unnamed? Their stories like sparks in the dark, waiting for someone, perhaps you, to notice their glow. Battle and silence. You enter the stories of real battles. Women at the walls, defending against invaders. The clatter of arrows fades, leaving the silence of unmarked graves and memories few recall. The story shifts now, from the courtyard of training to the storm of battle. It is no longer dawn or quiet afternoon. It is the uneasy hour when drums echo, when dust rises from marching feet, when the horizon carries the shadow of war. And in this hour, women stood at the threshold of their homes, weapons in hand, knowing that silence could break at any moment. You can almost hear the rush of arrows slicing the air, the sharp crack of wooden gates under pressure. Enemies came not only for soldiers on distant fields, but also for villages, for homes, for families unprotected. When men rode away, it was often women who remained, tasked with defense. And so, history tells of women who stood upon walls, bows ready, eyes scanning the horizon for movement. Their task was not glory, their task was survival. In these moments, the figure of the Onna-Bugeisha grows sharper. She's no longer only a figure of training. She's the steady heartbeat of defense. Her naginata gleams as she waits for invaders to cross the threshold. Her breath is measured, her stance rooted. Around her, others gather, neighbors, daughters, sometimes even the elderly, each ready to act in their own way. One such moment comes from the story of the siege of Aizu in the 19th century, where women organized themselves into a fighting unit known as the Joshigun, or Women's Army. Armed with naginata and rifles, they defended their stronghold with fierce resolve. Though many of their names are lost to us, their courage carved a mark into history, even if only in whispers. But battles are not remembered only for the clash of weapons. They are remembered for what follows. Silence. Imagine the aftermath of such fighting. The smoke clears, the dust settles, and the ground is littered with fragments. Broken arrows, torn cloth, abandoned helmets. In this silence, women walk slowly across the field, searching for those they knew, tending to the wounded, mourning the fallen. Their steps are heavy, their faces calm but marked by sorrow. The silence after battle is often louder than the clash itself. For the women who fought or who stood guard, it meant returning to the rhythms of life as if nothing had changed. A pot still needed to be stirred, children still needed care, fields still needed tending. And yet, inside, they carried the memory of what had passed. The cries, the resistance, the knowledge that their hands had defended what they loved most. It is here, in this silence, that history often looks away. Chroniclers write of the victories of generals, the strategies of men. They note the number of enemy soldiers slain, the lands conquered, the treaties signed. But they rarely note the women who guarded the gate, who kept a village standing, who raised weapons only to fade back into ordinary life once danger passed. Close your eyes, and you can imagine them in this silence. Women sitting together, blades laid beside them, speaking in low voices about what was endured. Their stories rarely left the circle of those who shared them. Yet the echoes remain, faint but steady, if you choose to listen. As you drift with these images, you may notice how silence is not absence. It is presence in another form. Silence carries memory, it holds weight, it keeps stories alive even when words do not. And perhaps, in the hush after battle, these women found their own kind of strength. Not in being remembered, but in knowing they had acted when it mattered most. And so, the question lingers softly in your mind. When history falls silent, what truths are still breathing, waiting for someone to listen? Shadows in history. You notice how scrolls and records grow quiet, how the names of women are thinned away. Male victories were carved in stone, while female courage was left drifting in smoke. The story of women samurai does not end with the clang of battle or the quiet after. It also unfolds in the shadows, those dim spaces where history records less than it should, where voices fade not because they were weak, but because they were overlooked. You begin to notice how the scrolls grow quieter, how the lines of text shorten when they speak of women, how the ink thins as if memory itself hesitated to remember. For every famous warrior whose name survives, there were countless women whose lives dissolved into silence. Chroniclers, often men, preferred the tales of generals, of emperors, of male heroes riding into the storm. Their victories were carved into stone, their deeds sung across centuries. The women who trained, who defended, who sometimes died with weapons still in hand. These women were left in the margins, unmentioned or only lightly acknowledged. It is as though you are walking through an old archive, shelves lined with dusty records. You search for the women, but the scrolls whisper only faintly. Their names are missing or written in passing, as if they mattered less. And yet, between the lines, you sense their presence. The shadows themselves seem to hold their memory, a quiet defiance against erasure. Why does history do this? Partly, it is habit. Societies preserve the stories that align with their values. For centuries, the narrative of strength was bound to men, while the narrative of care was bound to women. To admit that women could embody both strength and care unsettled the order. And so, the record keepers dimmed their presence, pushing them into silence. But silence is not the same as absence. Think of shadows in the late afternoon. They stretch long across the ground, not because the object is gone, but because the light has shifted. The women samurai remain, their shadows reaching us even now, long after the light of their time has faded. If you pause, if you listen, you can feel their weight, their shape, even if the details blur. Imagine a nameless woman, her naginata resting against her shoulder, her gaze steady on a horizon we no longer see. Her name was never written down, her deeds were never sung, but she lived, she acted, she mattered. The absence of her story and records does not erase the truth of her life. Her existence breathed through the silence, just as wind moves through unseen spaces. The shadows in history are also invitations. They ask you to wonder, to fill the gaps with questions, to recognize that what is missing still shapes what remains. When you think of samurai now, perhaps you remember not only armored men, but also the women whose lives pressed quietly against the edges of memory. Their shadows remind us that the story is larger than we were taught. In this way, shadows become gentle teachers. They remind you to look again, to notice what has been overlooked, to ask what else has been left out. They whisper, history is never complete, never whole. It is always a tapestry with threads missing, colors faded, patterns half seen. And in those missing places, entire lives once bloomed. As you lie with this thought, a question lingers softly in your mind. When you see only shadows, can you learn to honor them as presence rather than absence? Can you allow the unseen to matter as much as the seen? A gentle reflection. You return to the present, feeling the weight of stories nearly erased. The women samurai stand in your mind's eye, guardians, forgotten, yet alive in the hush before sleep. The story begins to quiet now. The battles have faded, the training grounds stand empty, and the scrolls lie closed upon their shelves. You are left with the echo of footsteps, the glint of a blade remembered, the soft presence of women who once stood watch. Their lives drift across your mind like lanterns floating downstream. Each one small, each one luminous, each one carrying a piece of history nearly lost. As you sit with their memory, you feel how heavy absence can be. These women, the guardians of homes, the defenders of families, the quiet warriors of dawn, existed in flesh and spirit. Yet history pushed them aside, dimming their voices until only fragments remained. And still, the fragments are enough. Even a whisper is enough, if you choose to lean close and listen. Perhaps you picture them gathered in silence. A circle of women, weapons resting nearby, Children nestled against their sides, the glow of firelight touching their faces. Their stories flow not as grand speeches, but as murmurs, accounts passed from mother to daughter, not meant for fame, but for survival. Through these murmurs, their courage lived on, carried like a seed from one generation to the next. The Onna-Bugeisha remind you of something important, that strength is not always loud, not always celebrated. Sometimes it is hidden in small acts, in daily readiness, in the refusal to yield, even when the world is watching elsewhere. Their story is a mirror, reflecting the truth that history is often incomplete. It shows us the power of remembering, of noticing what has been overlooked. Think of the way cherry blossoms fall in spring. Their petals drift softly to the ground, vanishing quickly, yet their beauty lingers in memory. The women samurai are like that. Their names may have scattered, their deeds forgotten, yet the impression remains, delicate and persistent. To notice them now is to honor what was once alive, to keep their presence blooming even in silence. You may wonder what it means for you, listening here in the quiet of night. Perhaps their story reminds you of the hidden strengths in your own life, the ways you endure quietly, the ways you protect what matters, the ways you hold steady when no one is watching. These echoes of resilience are not confined to history. They live in you too, steady and unseen, waiting to be noticed. The gentle reflection is this: stories are never finished. What has been erased can be remembered. What has been shadowed can be honored. When you close your eyes, you can still see the figure of a woman, standing firm with her naginata, her gaze steady, her heart calm. She does not ask to be celebrated. She asks only to be remembered. And so, as the story closes, you allow yourself to rest. You breathe slowly, deeply, letting the weight of the day fade. The whispers of the past settle like soft rain, soothing, steady, reminding you that silence too holds power. The women samurai walk beside you in thought, their presence a comfort, their resilience a lullaby. Now, in the quiet, you feel a final question rise and dissolve. Their strength could endure centuries of silence. What quiet strengths in you might also last, long after the noise has passed? The quiet lanterns. The story has reached its end, yet it lingers softly, like a candle glowing after the flame is blown out. You have walked through the dawn of forgotten training grounds, through battles and silences, through shadows where names were lost. And now, you rest in the gentle presence of memory. The women samurai do not rise loudly from the pages of history. They drift instead, like lanterns carried on a quiet river, their light small but steady. Each lantern holds a life, a story, an echo of courage. Though the chronicles may have dimmed them, though time may have passed them by, their glow remains for those willing to see. As you close your eyes, you might imagine their figures fading into mist. Graceful, resilient, neither defeated nor triumphant, simply enduring. They remind you that history is more than noise and battle cries. It is also whispers, pauses, and silences that carry truth in softer ways. Let their story settle gently into your thoughts tonight. Let it remind you that unseen strength is still strength, that quiet endurance is still victory. And as sleep approaches, may you carry their lantern light with you into your dreams, steady, calm, eternal. You have now wandered through the entire story of women samurai, boring history for sleep. Their presence was never written in bold lines, but in whispers, in shadows, in the quiet strength of protection and devotion. These women stood not for glory, but for duty, carrying blades with the same hands that nurtured, defending homes with the same hearts that loved. As the echoes of their story settle, let your mind rest with them. Imagine their lantern light flickering across time, steady and enduring, reminding you that strength is often hidden, quiet and unseen. Just as their memory lives softly in history, so too may your thoughts tonight drift gently, without urgency, without weight. This has been Mythoria, where history becomes a lullaby, and forgotten voices are given space to breathe again. Allow the stillness to hold you now, as sleep rises to meet you. Rest well and carry with you the calm strength of the women samurai.